Hi class, in this video we're going to do the Foundational 15 for Chapter 1. Now as I work through these Foundational 15 problems for each chapter, I highly encourage you to try the problems as we go on your own. So as we go one problem to the next, I would suggest pausing the video before I work through it, just to see where you're at and to compare your answer to my answer. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. So we're looking at Martinez Company's information here, and it says Martinez Company's relevant range of production is 7,500 units to 12,500 units. When it produces and sells 10,000 units, its average cost per unit are as follows. So it gives us the average cost per unit for direct materials, direct labor, variable manufacturing overhead, fixed manufacturing overhead, fixed selling expense, fixed admin expense, sales commissions, and variable admin expense. So in this Foundational 15, we're going to be comparing our what we know about product cost versus period cost, and variable costs versus fixed costs versus mixed costs. So we're really exercising our different cost classifications for this Foundational 15. So we'll go one at a time here. Now, one thing that's important to mention is that we're looking at a specific relevant range here. So remember, when we say a fixed cost behaves a certain way per unit and in total, and a variable cost and a mixed cost behaves in a specific way in total and per unit, those behaviors only apply within the relevant range. So as an example, if we take a fixed cost like rent, so let's imagine that the fixed cost of rent for a building for a business, let's say it's $1,000 a month. But so we know that fixed cost every month, it's a fixed amount of $1,000 regardless of how much work is done within that building, right? They still have to pay that rent. But now, if the company realizes, oh goodness, we need more space, we actually also need to rent the building right next to us because our production is just increasing to that rate that we can't do it all in that one building. We need to go rent that second building next door. Well, all of a sudden, that fixed cost of $1,000 has now fundamentally changed. That $1,000 doesn't apply anymore. Right now, let's say it's $1,000 for the building next door. Now your rent will go from $1,000 to $2,000 a month. It's still a fixed cost, right? But as soon as you go outside of that relevant range of production where you need to make more units and you can't do that level of production with the space you have, all of a sudden now you have to go and spend more on rent every month. So when we say these fixed and variable and mixed costs behave a certain way, that will only apply within a relevant range of production. As soon as we go beyond that relevant range, those costs might change. So that's just something that is worth mentioning here. Okay, so let's start with number 1. So question 1 says, for financial accounting purposes, what is the total amount of product costs incurred to make 10,000 units? Okay, so we have to recall what is a product cost. So a product cost, remember, it's those costs that a company incurs to ultimately make a product, the cost of making a product. So we know that the fundamental calculation for product cost is as follows. It's made of our direct materials costs plus our direct labor costs and then manufacturing overhead. But manufacturing overhead, that tends to be a mixed cost. So instead of just putting manufacturing overhead there as one item, I'm going to break it up into its two elements, which is its variable portion of manufacturing overhead and the fixed portion of variable manufacturing overhead. Fixed portion of manufacturing overhead. So we have variable and fixed manufacturing overhead making up the total amount there. So all we want to do now is just plug in what we know. If we know that those added together equal product costs, we just want to find those elements here. But they give us the average cost per unit for each of these elements. So they don't give it to us in total. So it asks us what is the total amount of product cost incurred to make 10,000 units here. So let's look at direct materials. So here we're just going to do the per unit portions here. So, and keep in mind it says that these average costs down below are for a level of 10,000 units. So we know variable costs per unit will stay the same, regardless of your level of production within the relevant range. But fixed costs per unit will vary inversely as activity changes. So when we look at these fixed costs here that are shown on a per unit basis, like our fixed manufacturing overhead, that's only $4 a unit at a level of 10,000 units. So because they're asking us for the total product cost of making 10,000 units, we can go ahead and use that $4 there. Okay, but let's go ahead and first find out the cost per unit here to make 10,000 units. So the direct materials, that's $6 a unit. Direct labor is $3.50 per unit. The variable overhead is $1.50 per unit. And the fixed manufacturing overhead, that worked out to $4 per unit at a level of 10,000 units. Okay, but more often than not, we won't work with fixed overhead on a per unit basis when we're making this calculation. We'll work with it on a total basis, since in total, the fixed costs will stay the same. But here, let's add together all of these per unit amounts. We have 6 plus 3.5 plus 1.5 plus 4. That's a total product cost per unit of $15. So that's total product cost per unit. But the question asks us what the total product cost is to make those 10,000 units. So since we know that the average cost of making these 10,000 units is $15 a unit, we'll take that $15 and multiply it by the 10,000 units. When we do that, we're going to get $150,000 of product cost. So that on average, it's costing the company about $150,000 to produce those 10,000 units. But I don't want you to get into a habit of including that per unit amount for fixed overhead in this calculation as we did here. It worked out because it was the same level of activity. This you can always add together. All of the variable cost per unit can be added together for a total variable product cost. But I want to illustrate a different method that we can actually do this problem and how you should get familiar with doing this problem. So when you see that fixed manufacturing overhead of $4 per unit, that's only $4 a unit when the company produces 10,000 units. So we ask ourselves, okay, well, if when there's 10,000 units being produced, what does that mean for the total fixed manufacturing overhead for that period then? Well, if we produce 10,000 units and the fixed overhead came out to $4 a unit, that means that our fixed overhead for the period is $40,000. But this fixed overhead of $40,000, since it's fixed, right? It's a fixed cost. That's the fixed overhead this period and every period thereafter. Unless something fundamentally changes with the cost structure, like we talked about the rent, or if there's salaries being taken away or being added in. But this $40,000, since it's a fixed cost, it'll stay the same in total. Now, for any given period, you can convert that fixed overhead or any fixed cost to a per unit amount to figure out what does that fixed cost come out to on a per unit basis for that period. So these fixed costs, they're fixed, right? So they don't change, but we can find out what is that costing us on a per unit basis. So the more production we have, the more units we're spreading that $40,000 across. But the less units that we're producing, the more expensive actually it is per unit in terms of that fixed overhead. So here's another way we could have done this calculation. So we know that the calculation for product cost is the direct materials, direct labor plus overhead. But we will do the variable costs first. So we know the variable portion of a product's cost is direct materials plus direct labor plus variable overhead. So the $6 plus the $3.50 plus the $1.50. So when we add that together, we do 6 plus 3.5 plus 1.5. That's $11 in variable product cost. Now, that's the cost per unit in terms of variable costs. We're going to multiply that then by 10,000 units to figure out what the variable product cost is to produce those 10,000 units. So we'll multiply that 11 by 10,000 units. 11 times 10,000 units, that's $110,000 in variable product cost. But then the question asks for total product cost. So total product cost is your variable product cost plus your fixed product cost added together. So we'll take that $110,000 of variable product cost plus the $40,000 of fixed product cost, which is that fixed manufacturing overhead. $110,000 plus $40,000 is $150,000 of total product cost. So we found the same answer, right? But when we do it this way, we're making sure to recognize the fact that this fixed overhead of $40,000 will apply this period and the next, as long as we're operating within that relevant range of 7,500 to 12,500 units. All right, so for number one, we've just calculated the product cost incurred to make 10,000 units. So remember, product cost, that's manufacturing cost, the cost of manufacturing a product. Now, a period cost, those are non-manufacturing costs. Those costs not involved with the production and manufacture of our product. So question number 2 asks us, for financial accounting purposes, what is the total amount of period costs incurred to sell 10,000 units? Okay, so this is not to do with manufacturing, but anything not related to manufacturing costs. So any non-manufacturing costs is what we would add together for period costs. So direct materials, direct labor, variable overhead, and fixed overhead, we've already determined all of those to be product costs. Okay, those are variable and fixed product costs. But then we look at the remainder of the list: selling expense, fixed administrative expense, sales commissions, and variable administrative expense. All of these are non-manufacturing costs that aren't directly related to the actual production of our product. So we have fixed and variable period costs here. So we have fixed selling and fixed admin costs. And then we have sales commissions. Sales commissions are a variable cost. And then variable admin expense. So we can add the fixed period costs together and then the variable costs together, because these are all on a per unit basis. We have to convert them to totals. So just as a reminder, fixed costs are only shown on a per unit basis for a specific level of activity. So this fixed selling expense came out to $3 a unit when you're producing and selling 10,000 units. Now, next period, if we were to produce and sell 12,000 units, that fixed selling expense will no longer be $3 a unit. It will actually be less than that, okay? So let's first find out what the fixed selling expense comes out to in total. So it's $3 a unit when 10,000 units are sold. So 3 times 10,000, that means that the total fixed selling expense each period is $30,000. But since they produced and sold 10,000 units this period, that worked out to about $3 per unit here. So that $3 a unit is just applicable to this level of activity of 10,000 units. Next, let's find the fixed admin cost. So when producing and selling 10,000 units, that cost came out to $2 a unit. So if they produced and sold 10,000 units, that means the total fixed administrative expense comes out to $20,000 per period. Okay, so this $30,000 selling expense, fixed selling expense, and this $20,000 fixed administrative expense, those are the fixed period costs each and every period. So that will stay the same as long as we're operating within that relevant range of activity. So the total fixed period costs here come out to $50,000. So this is the total fixed selling not just fixed selling costs, but total fixed period costs. Okay, but that's not the total period costs. That's just the fixed portion. So now we have to find the variable period costs. So the sales commissions, that's a variable cost. So variable costs stay the same per unit. So that $1 of sales commissions per unit and the 50 cents of variable admin expenses, that stays the same whether you make 10,000 units, 7,000 units, 12,000 units. That will stay the same as long as you're within that relevant range. In total, however, we know these variable expenses will vary proportionately depending on what that level of production is or what that level of activity is. But it's those fixed costs that don't stay the same per unit, they stay the same in total. And per unit, they vary inversely as activity goes up and down. All right, so these sales commissions comes out to $1 a unit sold. And if we sell 10,000 units, the total sales commission cost comes to $10,000 for this level of activity. And then we have variable admin expense. That comes out to 50 cents per unit within the relevant range. And if we made and sold 10,000 units, our total variable administrative cost comes out to $5,000. So the total variable period costs here come out to $15,000 here. Actually, let's just double check that. We have 50 cents times $10,000 plus the $10,000 of sales commission. So that comes out to $15,000 there. Very good. So that's my total variable period cost. So what's the total period cost overall? Well, total cost is the same if we're just talking about not total variable or total fixed, but just overall total cost. Total cost is a mixture of its fixed and variable elements. So we're looking at really what's the mixed cost here. The total period cost or total mixed period cost just is made up of the total fixed period costs plus the total variable period costs here. So 50,000 plus 15,000, that comes out to $65,000 in total. So I just want to make sure to clarify before I move on to the next problem here that with 1 and 2, we now compared a period cost to product cost. So product versus period costs. So product costs are manufacturing costs, period costs are non-manufacturing costs. So I want to just clarify that product costs can be both fixed and variable. Same with period costs. They can also be fixed and variable in a mixture of the two. So when we talk about total fixed cost, well, if I just asked you what's the total fixed cost, then we're going to have to go through this list and add all the fixed costs together, whether they are product or period costs. And if I ask you what are the total variable costs associated with this company for this period, you're going to have to add all the variable costs together, regardless of its period or product cost. So product and period costs can both be variable and fixed and or mixed. Okay, so there's different distinctions even within cost type. So we can talk about fixed and variable cost overall, but also fixed and variable costs within a category like product and like period costs. So that helps us lead into the next question. So the next question asks us, if 8,000 units are produced and sold, what is the variable cost per unit produced and sold? So the variable cost per unit produced and sold. So we want to see, did this question ask us for total variable product cost, total variable period cost? No, it just asks us for what the variable cost is per unit. So total variable cost per unit. So they asked us if 8,000 units are produced and sold, what's the variable cost per unit? Well, what do we know about variable costs per unit within the relevant range? Well, as long as we're within the relevant range, per unit variable costs will stay the same. So is 8,000 units within that relevant range? It falls within that relevant range, yes. So that means for any of these variable costs per unit in this list, they will still apply to 8,000 units just as they do to 10,000 units on a per unit basis. Okay, we're talking on per unit, not total, as in the overall total variable cost as a dollar figure. So what are the variable costs here? What are the variable costs per unit here? Well, we know direct materials is a variable cost. We know direct labor is a variable cost. We know variable manufacturing overhead is a variable cost since it has it in the name. But then if we keep going down the list, we see fixed, 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 so we'll skip those. Those aren't variable. The last two are variable costs, right? Sales commissions is variable and variable administrative expense is variable. So we'll add the commissions and the variable admin. And we already know what each of these are per unit. We're trying to find the total per unit variable cost. So direct materials is $6 per unit. Direct labor is $3.50 per unit. Variable and manufacturing overhead is $1.50 per unit. Commissions is $1 per unit. And variable admin expense is 50 cents per unit. So we're just going to add all of these variable costs per unit together to find out what the total variable cost is per unit produced and sold. So we'll take the $6 plus $3.50 plus the $1.50 plus the $1 plus the 50 cents. So that comes out to $12.50 of variable cost per unit, just on a per unit basis. Okay, so when we produce and sell 8,000 units, the variable cost per unit is $12.50 per unit here. Now, if we go on to number 4, what's number 4 asking us? If 12,500 units are produced and sold, what is the variable cost per unit produced and sold? Well, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, does that level of production fall within the relevant range? Well, the relevant range is 7,500 to 12,500. Does 12,500 fall within that relevant range? Yes, it does, but barely, right? It's right on the edge there, so it falls within that relevant range. So we know that within the relevant range, that variable costs stay the same per unit, and they vary proportionately in total as activity varies. Fixed costs within the relevant range will stay the same in total, but vary inversely per unit as activity varies. So now they're asking us the same question they did in number 3, but with a different level of activity. So they're asking us, if 12,500 units are produced and sold, what is the variable cost per unit now? We found it for 8,000 units, but what is it now at a level of 12,500 units? Well, guess what? We don't have to do any math for this problem. Because what did we say about variable costs per unit? They stay the same, they stay constant, as long as we're within the relevant range. So whether we produce and sell 8,000 units or produce and sell 12,500 units, that total variable cost per unit will stay the same. So the answer is the same for number 4 as it is for number 3. Okay, so even if the question asks, what if I produce and sell 11,000 units? What's my total variable cost per unit? Then the answer should be $12.50 per unit. Okay, because the per unit variable costs will stay the same. It's when we actually convert them to totals that it will vary depending on what the actual number is that you're multiplying it by, right? Because these are per unit. So the total variable cost for a period will depend on the total units that you produce and sell within a period. But when we're talking about what it costs per unit, that will stay constant as long as we're within the relevant range. All right, let's see what number 5 is asking. If 8,000 units are produced and sold, what is the total amount of variable costs related to the units produced and sold? So now they're actually having us go one step further. If we know that the variable costs overall, period and product, if the variable costs per unit come out to $12.50 per unit, they're asking us now, okay, well, if we sell and produce, or produce and sell 8,000 units, what does the total variable cost come out to? Not per unit, but the total. Here's where we're going to convert that $12.50 per unit to a total amount. Okay, because we said the $12.50 is what stays the same on a unit basis, but now we're going to see how a variable cost varies in total depending on what you're plugging in here. So the cost is $12.50 per unit, but they're asking us, what if you produce and sell 8,000 units? What does that total variable cost come out to when you have that level of production? Well, we're going to take that $12.50 and multiply it by 8,000 units, and then we get $100,000. So the total variable costs when we produce and sell 8,000 units is $100,000. Okay, we used this per unit amount, multiplied it out by the level of activity that we're talking about to find that when we make and sell 8,000 units, this is the expected and estimated amount of total variable cost. And that would be, we know that 100,000 is a mixture of variable product and variable period costs. Okay, very good. On to number 6. Same question, different level of activity. Number 6 is asking us if 12,500 units are produced and sold, not 8,000, but 12,500 units, what is the total amount of variable cost related to the units produced and sold? All right, remember, variable costs per unit stay the same within the relevant range. So, but in total, variable costs vary proportionately as activity varies. So now they're asking us the same thing, but what's the variable cost for 12,500 units instead of 8,000? Now, going from 8,000 units to 12,500 units, the variable cost per unit, that didn't change, right? That stays the same per unit. So that's still $12.50 per unit. But now we're going to convert that to a total amount. And if we are producing and selling 12,500 units, what's the total variable cost then? We're going to take that $12.50 times the 12,500, and then we can see that our total variable cost comes out to $156,250 for our total variable cost when we are producing and selling 12,500 units. So this is a great illustration, because we can see, and by the way, up here it was 8,000 units. So when we were producing and selling 8,000 units versus 12,500 units, what stayed the same? When activity fluctuated, our variable cost per unit stayed the same. But when we went from 8,000 units to 12,500 units, what did change? What didn't stay the same? When we went from 8,000 to 12,500 units, our variable costs in total varied. As activity went up from 8,000 units to 12,500 units, so did our total variable costs. That's a proportionate relationship. All right, so let's move on to number 7. Number 7 asks us, if 8,000 units are produced and sold, what is the average fixed manufacturing cost per unit produced? Okay, so here we're trying to figure out what our average fixed manufacturing cost is per unit produced when 8,000 units are produced. So remember, when we look at this table here, we have fixed manufacturing overhead here of $4 per unit. But remember, fixed costs in total, they stay the same, but per unit, they vary inversely depending on what activity level we're talking about. So that $4 of fixed overhead per unit, that is only applicable to an activity level of how much? 10,000 units. So that's why when in the beginning here, we converted that $4 to figure out, okay, what's the actual total fixed overhead each period? And we found that to be $40,200. if I scroll back up here to the top, right? Where we took the $4 per unit, multiplied it by the level of activity that it's applicable to, and found that, okay, at every period, then the fixed overhead is really $40,000 overall. Okay, so we can redo that calculation down here. So just remember, fixed overhead, you'll only see it on a per unit basis when we're talking about a specific level of activity. It only applies to a specific level of activity. So when you see the fixed manufacturing overhead here of $4 a unit, that's only for a level of activity of 10,000 units. So we multiply that out and say $4 a unit times 10,000 units. That comes out to $40,000 of fixed manufacturing overhead each period. Okay, so that is unchanging within the relevant range. Every period, regardless of how much you're producing within that relevant range, that's what your fixed overhead is estimated to come out to. But now the question is asking, okay, well, if you produce 8,000 units, not 10,000 units, what is the fixed overhead or fixed manufacturing overhead cost per unit? And keep in mind, we're talking about fixed manufacturing overhead cost here, since they're asking us about fixed manufacturing cost, which is fixed product cost. The only fixed product cost on this list is that fixed manufacturing overhead. Okay, so when the question is asking you about fixed manufacturing cost, it's asking about fixed manufacturing overhead. Okay, so in total, that $40,000 will stay the same each period whether I produce 7,500, 8,000, 9,000, 12,000 units. As long as I'm within the relevant range, that 40,000 will apply. That is what we can expect each period in terms of fixed overhead cost. But we want to know, okay, well, what does that $40,000 of fixed overhead come out to per unit when I produce 8,000 units? So when we produced 10,000 units, you were spreading out that 40,000 amongst more units versus 8,000 units, right? So that 40,000 was cut into more pieces, was cut into 10,000 pieces, making each piece $4 per piece or per unit. But when you only produce 8,000 units, you're spreading that $40,000 of fixed overhead amongst less units. You're cutting it into less pieces. So each piece will represent a larger portion of that $40,000. So to illustrate, we know that the cost is $40,000 each period, but since we produce 8,000 units in this period that they're talking about, let's see what it's actually costing us per unit produced in terms of fixed overhead. Here we can see it comes out to $5 per unit of fixed manufacturing overhead. So although the $40,000 is incurred when we make 10,000 units and when we make 8,000 units, per unit it looks a bit different. When we make 10,000 units, it only really comes out to $4 per unit produced, but when you produce only 8,000 units, it comes out to $5 per unit produced. And it all comes down to the fact that we're spreading that cost amongst less units, the less amount that you're producing. So that's why companies like to maximize production whenever possible, because they know those fixed costs are going to be there whether they produce or don't produce, right? So it's better to produce more so that they can spread that cost amongst more units. So to illustrate, just to give you an example, we talked about that $1,000 rent as a fixed cost. If I produce 1 unit in a given month, what's the cost of that rent per unit of product that I make? Well, if I only make 1 unit, then the cost of rent is $1,000 per unit. That's some expensive square footage there, right? Because if I only use that rent to make 1 unit, then it's costing me $1,000 in rent per unit. But what if I make 100 units in a given month? What does my rent come out to per unit produced? Well, then it comes out to only $10 per unit, all right? Because if we take $1,000 of rent and divide it by 100 units produced, then that's a lot better, right? We're spreading out that cost of rent amongst more units produced. Because why do you rent a building? So you can produce, right? Operate the business. So this is an illustration. The rent itself stays the same in total each and every month, but per unit, it varies inversely depending on how much activity there is. The lower the activity, the higher the per unit cost. The higher the activity, the lower the per unit cost. Okay, so that's what we were illustrating here with number 7. Okay, let's go on to number 8. If 12,500 units are produced, what is the average fixed manufacturing cost per unit produced? So we're going to do the exact same thing here, right? Now we're going to really illustrate how does that fixed overhead per unit change when you ramp up production from 8 all the way up to 12,500 units. And just keep in mind, we're still within that relevant range, so this will still apply. So what's our fixed overhead each and every period? Well, we know that to be $40,000, right? A fixed manufacturing overhead each period. But now they're asking, okay, well, if you produce 12,500 units in a given period, what does that fixed overhead come out to then per unit? Well, we're going to divide that now by 12,500 units. And the calculator will take that 40,000, divide by 12,500, and that gives us $3.20 of fixed manufacturing overhead per unit. So it's the same $40,000 overall in total for the period, right? But depending on how much we actually produced in spending that fixed overhead, the per unit amount of fixed overhead differs. When we go from 8,000 units of production to 12,500 units of production, we're spreading that fixed overhead amongst more units. So we go from $5 per unit of fixed overhead down to $3.20 of fixed overhead per unit. Okay, so now this is illustrating that fixed costs in total stay the same, right? 40 and 40 each period, but per unit, fixed costs vary inversely as activity changes. When activity goes down, right, when we go from 8,000 to 12,500 units, as activity goes down, up here, we go from 8,000 to 12,500 units, activity's going up. So when activity goes up from 8 to 12.5 here, the cost per unit goes down. Okay, so let me write that here. So when activity goes up, the fixed costs per unit go down. But when activity goes down, so let's say we go from 12,500 down to 8,000, when activity goes down, your fixed costs per unit go up, right? Because if we go down from 12.5 to 8, it goes from $3.20 per unit to $5 per unit. So the lower your activity, the less units you get to spread that fixed cost across. All right, very good. So we will move on to question 9. All right, number 9 asks us, if 8,000 units are produced, what is the total amount of fixed manufacturing cost incurred to support this level of production? Okay. So it's not a trick question, and we don't want to overthink any of this, right? So the question is, if 8,000 units are produced, let me scroll back up here a little bit. If 8,000 units are produced, what is the total amount of fixed manufacturing costs? Total amount of fixed manufacturing cost incurred to support this level of production. And I can tell you right now, we've already done any math necessary to answer this question. We don't have to do any more math. What's the total fixed manufacturing cost incurred to support 8,000 units of production? Guess what the answer is? Answer is $40,000, right? Because we already determined that within the relevant range of 7,500 units to 12,500 units, that the total fixed overhead or total fixed manufacturing overhead is $40,000 each period, as long as we're within that relevant range. So when the question asks us, okay, well then what's your fixed overhead when you make 8,000 units? What's the total fixed overhead then? Well, then we just said it's $40,000, right? So that won't change. Total fixed costs in total stay the same. So it's $40,000. What about number 10? If 12,500 units are produced, what is the total amount of fixed manufacturing cost incurred to support this level of production? I think you know this answer, right? What should the answer be here? What's the total fixed overhead when we produce 12,500 units? What is the total fixed manufacturing overhead when we make 12,500 units? Well, as long as we're within the relevant range, we know within the relevant range, fixed costs stay the same in total as activity fluctuates. So if total fixed overhead at 8,000 units is 40,000, total fixed overhead at 12,500 units should also be $40,000. Okay, so the total fixed overhead will be 40,000 every period, regardless of how much we produce within that relevant range. Okay, on to number 11. If 8,000 units are produced, what is the total amount of manufacturing overhead cost incurred to support this level of production? What is this total amount expressed on a per unit basis? So on the surface, it might look like they're asking you the same question, but they're actually not. We want to look carefully at what's being asked. It says, if 8,000 units are produced, what is the total amount of manufacturing overhead cost? So total manufacturing overhead cost is broken up between variable overhead and fixed overhead, right? So they're asking us when we produce 8,000 units, they're asking us what the total manufacturing overhead is, not just the fixed element, not just the variable element, but what the total is. But good news is we already know what the fixed portion is, don't we? We just determined that in number 9. We already knew that going into number 9, actually, right? We know that the fixed manufacturing overhead cost when we produce 8,000 units is $40,000, right? But we want to add that to the variable manufacturing overhead, because fixed overhead plus variable overhead gives us total overhead. Okay, so I'll do just manufacturing overhead as overall here. But how do I find my variable manufacturing overhead? Well, they give us the variable manufacturing overhead per unit, right? Per unit, this amount will stay the same within the relevant range. So the variable overhead costs us about $1.50 per unit. Well, if we're talking about in number 11, 8,000 units, if I want to know what my total variable manufacturing overhead is estimated to be, we'll just take that $1.50 of variable overhead per unit and multiply it by the 8,000 units. So now we'll just bring all of this down. We know the fixed element is 40,000. And then the variable element, what's the variable element? That's 150 times 8,000 units. That comes out to $12,000 here. Okay. Now we're going to add these two together. 12,000 plus 40,000. Oops. That's a mistake. We'll do 12,000 plus 40,000. That gives us total manufacturing overhead of $52,000 when there are 8,000 units produced. And what did we actually just do here? What did we actually utilize? What formula did we utilize here? We actually utilized our y equals a plus bx formula, or mixed cost formula, or total cost formula here. A is the fixed element, right? A is the 40,000. B is the variable cost per unit, the variable overhead per unit of 150, and X is your level of activity, which is 8,000 units. And Y is your total manufacturing cost, or total cost in this case, right, which comes out to the $52,000. All right, so when they ask us what's the total manufacturing overhead, we know it's made up of total fixed overhead and total variable overhead to give us that overall amount here. All right, very good, and we'll move on to number 12. Number 12 asks us, if 12,500 units are produced, not 8,000, but 12,500, What is the total amount of manufacturing overhead cost incurred to support this level of production? What is this total amount expressed on a per unit basis? So we're doing exactly the same thing here, right? Exactly what we did here with number 11, but now finding total manufacturing overhead cost for a level of not 8,000 units, but 12,500 units. So we know that the fixed manufacturing overhead, as long as we're within the relevant range, what's the fixed overhead each period? That's the $40,000, right? But the variable manufacturing overhead is what will vary proportionately in total, depending on what level of activity it is we're talking about. All right, so what's that variable manufacturing overhead per unit? Well, we know it's 150, right? So we'll plug in the 150 here. We have to multiply that 150 by the level of activity that we're talking about, which is 12,500 units. So we'll bring down the $40,000 because that's the fixed element. And then 150 times 12,500 units, that's 18,750. Now we have our fixed and variable elements, so we'll add that 18,750. We'll add that to our 40,000, and that gives us 58,750. Total manufacturing overhead cost. And again, just a reminder, this goes back to that cost formula of y equals a plus bx. A being the fixed portion of the cost, in this case 40,000, b being the variable cost per unit, which is the 150, and x being your level of activity, which in this case is 12,500. And y is your total cost or your total mixed cost. In this case, the total mixed cost that we're trying to find is total manufacturing overhead, and that gave us the 58,750. And this is not just a cost formula, but this is also the equation of a line. All right, very good. So we'll move on to number 13 here. All right. Let me scroll down here. Number 13 is asking us, if the selling price is $22 per unit, what is the contribution margin per unit? Okay, so to answer this question, we have to remind ourselves what contribution margin is and what that refers to. What is our contribution margin? What does that actually refer to? So your contribution margin, this can be calculated per unit and in total, but essentially your contribution margin, if we're talking about it in dollars, total dollars, it's what's left over of your revenues, of your sales, after you subtract out all of your variable costs. So in other words, it's what is left over from revenues / sales to cover those fixed costs. Okay, so it's going to be your sales minus all of your variable expenses. Okay, but we can also find the contribution margin per unit on a per unit basis, and that's the same idea. Only difference is we'll convert everything else to a per unit basis, so it's your selling price per unit minus your variable expenses per unit. So it basically tells us for every item I sell, how much of that money coming in for that unit I sold will actually go to cover the fixed costs that I have each period. All right, so we already found our total variable costs per unit when we were finding the, let's see here, number 3, we were finding the total variable cost per unit. We already determined that, right? We can go ahead and do that again. So before we try and plug in here, let's just find the total variable expenses per unit first. So that will be made up of our direct materials, our direct labor, our variable manufacturing overhead, all of those per unit, and then skip all the fixed items, right? And those last two are also variable costs. So plus the commissions, plus the variable admin. Okay, so the direct labor, remember that was the $6, direct materials is $6, direct labor $3.50 per unit, variable overhead $1.50 per unit, commissions $1 per unit, and variable admin costs are 50 cents per unit. So what are the total variable expenses per unit? We'll do 6 plus 350 plus 150 plus 1 plus 50 cents. So that comes out to $12.50, and that's familiar, right? We already had found that $12.50 per unit, right? We already determined that earlier on. So that's the variable costs per unit, all the variable costs, whether they're period or product. Okay, so what is the contribution margin per unit here? If the selling price is $22. Well, this contribution margin per unit, it's selling price per unit, which they tell us is $22, minus all of your variable costs per unit, which comes out to a total of $12.50 per unit. So we'll do 22 minus $12.50. That leaves us with the $9.50 per unit of contribution margin. So again, what does this mean? So for every unit we sell, how much money are we bringing in? We're bringing in $22. But also for every unit we sell, what did that unit cost us to produce and sell? $12.50. So how much would we have left of that $22 coming in to cover any and all fixed costs that the business is incurring? $9.50. So every unit is contributing, remember, the name is called contribution margin. Each unit that we sell is contributing $9.50 to the fixed cost burden that the company has. Okay, so each unit we sell is bringing in $22, but each unit that we sell is also costing us $12.50 in variable costs. So that leaves us with only $9.50 per unit to help cover the fixed cost that the company is incurring. Okay. All right, on to the next one, number 14. If 11,000 units are produced, what are the total amounts of direct and indirect manufacturing costs incurred to support this level of production? All right, so now we're looking at the classification of direct versus indirect manufacturing costs. So when we look at this list, where did we say it stops for manufacturing costs? We said that manufacturing costs are made up of direct materials, direct labor, variable overhead, and fixed overhead, right? Those are all manufacturing costs. But number 14 is now asking us, okay, what's the total amount of direct manufacturing cost when you produce 11,000 units? And then what's the amount of indirect manufacturing costs when you produce 11,000 units, right? So they're asking us, again, the level of activity here is 11,000 units. So the question is, what's the amount of direct manufacturing or product costs incurred? And then what's the total amount of indirect manufacturing / product costs incurred to make and sell, or essentially just make, because we're talking about manufacturing costs, to make 11,000 units. Okay, so let's start with our direct costs. This one's the easier one, right? Because the direct costs have the word direct in them, right? So we have direct materials and direct labor. But both of these are given on a per unit basis, right? We know the direct materials is $6 a unit, and the direct labor is $3.50 a unit. So we want to take this together and find out what the total direct costs or total direct manufacturing costs are. So let's find the total direct manufacturing cost per unit. What does that come out to? The total direct manufacturing cost per unit, that's $6 plus $3.50 per unit. That gives us $9.50 per unit. So we can convert that to a total direct manufacturing cost amount when we are producing 11,000 units, right? So we'll take that $9.50 of direct materials and direct labor cost, which is my direct manufacturing cost, and multiply it by 11,000 units to see what that cost comes out to. So we'll do 950. Actually, yeah, well, that's a different 950, but just to illustrate, 6 plus 350 times 11,000. That gives us $104,500 of direct manufacturing cost. So that's the direct manufacturing cost incurred to produce 11,000 units. Okay, now we're left with finding the total indirect manufacturing costs required to produce 11,000 units. So that is made up of variable manufacturing overhead and fixed manufacturing overhead. Because remember, manufacturing overhead, it's all those costs that aren't direct materials and direct labor, all those indirect materials and indirect labor costs, any indirect costs needed to produce product. So the fixed manufacturing overhead, we already know what that is in total, right? We know that's the $40,000 each period, regardless of what we produce, as long as we're within that relevant range of production. But the variable overhead, that's given on a per unit basis, and the variable overhead, that's $150 per unit. So we actually need to use that y equals a plus bx again to find the total indirect manufacturing cost, or in other words, the total manufacturing overhead cost to produce 11,000 units. So we can take that variable manufacturing overhead of 150 and multiply that by the 11,000 units to see what the total variable overhead cost comes out to when we produce 11,000 units. So we'll multiply that by 150, and that comes out to $16,500 of variable manufacturing overhead, which makes up a portion of the indirect manufacturing cost. And to that, we'll just add the fixed manufacturing overhead of $40,000. And we'll take that 16,500 plus the 40,000. That gives us $56,500 of total indirect manufacturing cost required to produce 11,000 units. So far we've compared product cost to period cost, or basically manufacturing cost and non-manufacturing cost. Then we've also looked at the classification of cost in terms of fixed versus variable, also mixed, and now direct versus indirect. Okay, so there's all different kinds of cost classifications, and some of those classifications even happen within a cost category. So we were comparing direct versus indirect manufacturing or product costs. So within that category of product costs, we were breaking those product costs down, not between variable and fixed elements, but between direct and indirect elements. Remember, direct costs can be directly traced to a unit of product. We know exactly how much we spent on this to produce that unit, where indirect costs are not as easy or impractical to trace to a unit of product. Okay, so for example, the cost of heating a factory, that's not so easily and practically traceable to one unit that we produce on a specific day as is direct materials, because you should know how much of a specific material is going in to production of a unit of product. Okay, so our direct versus indirect materials comes out to $104,500 and $56,500. So let's add those two together. So when we add the direct and indirect manufacturing costs together, we get $161,000. So that means the cost of manufacturing those 11,000 units comes out to $161,000. But here the problem asked us to actually just break it down between the direct and indirect portions. And lastly, number 15. What incremental manufacturing cost will Martinez incur if it increases production from 10,000 to 10,001 units? And so again, what incremental manufacturing cost will they incur if they produce just one extra unit? If they go from 10,000 to 10,001 units. Okay, so incremental manufacturing cost, that means what's the extra product costs that would be incurred by making one extra unit? Well, again, if we look at these product costs here that go from direct materials down to fixed manufacturing overhead, the fixed overhead, remember that $40,000 is incurred every period regardless of the level of production, right? So what are we going to have to spend additionally when we make an extra unit in terms of product cost? Well, we're going to have to spend $6 on direct materials, $3.50 on direct labor, and $1.50 on variable manufacturing overhead to make one extra unit. Okay, so we're talking about just incremental manufacturing cost is just another way of asking what is the extra cost incurred just to make one extra unit within the relevant range. Well, one unit is going to require direct materials, direct labor, and variable manufacturing overhead, right? The fixed overhead, that is incurred in total every period, and that doesn't change. The fixed overhead is incurred every period regardless of level of production as long as we're within the relevant range. So we know that to make one extra unit, it's going to cost us $6 on average in terms of direct materials. It's going to cost us $3.50 on average in terms of direct labor. We have to pay people to produce, right? And then there are some indirect costs that we found out on average come out to about $1.50 in terms of indirect manufacturing costs. Just those indirect things that aren't so easily traceable to that unit of product. Okay, so when we do 6 plus 350 plus 150, that comes out to $11 per unit. Okay, so in other words, what did we really find here? We really found the variable manufacturing cost per unit, right? Because variable overhead is also a manufacturing cost. The variable manufacturing overhead cost is $11 per unit. So if I make one extra unit, it's going to cost me on average about $11 in terms of additional manufacturing cost to produce that unit. The fixed overhead, remember, we're actually just spending on average about $40,000 every period, regardless of what we produce within a specific period. So we know for a fact, though, but when we produce that extra unit, it's going to cost us about $11 extra just to make one more unit. All right, you made it through all 15 questions of the Foundational 15. If needed, rewind to some problems that you need to do again. Pause, rewatch as many times as necessary until you understand the concepts fully. So mostly what was covered with this Foundational 15 is we just looked at all the different cost classifications and did calculations accordingly.